I was telling my sister, when they do,
Yeah.
if you charge for these things, everybody shows right up on time and everything. But when it's free, then people trickle in, so that's okay. So, thanks everybody for coming. I think to start off, I just want to, Jeannie is our office manager, and she has some experience that she can share that kind of gives you an idea a little bit about kind of the impact of what we do, because it's pretty significantly different than what you find in most places, and we have some pretty amazing results on a regular basis that kind of blows people away, and it's really pretty neat. So I was just going to let her kind of share a little bit about her experience.
So it's great to have you guys here. I actually was a patient myself 3 years ago at the Neuro clinic. I don't know if you know exactly, maybe that's what you're here for, what Lamont does and what Dr. Oliver does. I'd had 8 concussions from the time I was a little girl. I was on seizure medicine for 25 years, antidepressants. I basically was a non-functioning mother and wife of 5 kids, and had a lot of side effects and problems and resentments because people didn't understand what I was going through. And I came to Dr. Oliver 3 years ago. What we do in the clinic on the other side, it's basically the same thing, kind of, but we find the neural pathways that are not functioning properly. They're in dysfunction either from a head injury, a traumatic event, a virus, and we target those areas with therapy. I've been off all my medication, seizure-free, and working in my job that I have here, watching people's lives change, which I couldn't do before. In my 50s, I can do stuff I haven't been able to do in my whole life. When Lamont came on board, I started talking to him about my daughter, who has borderline personality disorder, Crohn's disease, post-traumatic stress, and she spent 8 years completely bedridden from chronic fatigue and other things. Her whole immune system shut down. But the most difficult thing out of all those things was trying to have a conversation with her, because she had borderline personality disorder. If any of you know what that is, it's really hard. And they usually go after the people that are the closest to them, and they have a fear of being abandoned. So she came in and spoke with him. He told me one day, and I haven't seen him in action, that in a 1 hour session, one session of 6 hours, some dramatic changes could happen, and I didn't believe him, because she's been through therapist after therapist after therapist, and me too, and our family's been fractured trying to figure out how to deal with this. And so we came one Saturday, and they spent about 6 hours together, and she has the ability to be able to have a conversation with us. But it's kind of like, I don't know if any of you have ever been to addiction classes where you go to help the person that's addicted and find out the only power you have is to help yourself. So as I met with Lamont and changed a lot of the things that were happening in my life, or not changed them, but understood in my 50s, I really wish I could have had access to this much younger. I think I would have had a different life, but because I haven't, I understand the burdens that people go through. I don't know if Lamont will tell you this. I tell this to people all the time. He has a patient that comes and sees him that's been to the top, but he's just one of the many who their life has been profoundly impacted. And this has affected me too, because we deal with addiction in our family with my parents. I have 2 children that have addiction issues. I have 2 children that have depression issues. But this gentleman has been to like several of the top rehab programs in the nation over the last 14 years, and through a string of therapists like my daughter. And as he's come through treatment in the clinic and seen Lamont, he's found answers that no one else has been able to give him, and it's very powerful. And as you listen to it, you'll go, that makes sense, it's wonderful. So I'm so glad that you're here, and it's a very life-changing thing. So I'll turn the time over to Lamont, she didn't come to hear, listen to me speak.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So, so those of you who kind of maybe don't know my story or kind of how I got here is that in my family and my spouse specifically, she suffered with the borderline personality disorder. And it was something that was pretty extreme, something I couldn't understand. For years, we tried all kinds of different things with very little effect on what it did. And
Can I make one more comment since
Sure.
you're talking about that? So when I knew Lamont's wife, but I didn't know she suffered with this. And when he told me, because I said, I don't know what you know about borderline personality disorder, when he said, my wife has it and I've been married for how long?
25 years.
I just burst into tears because everyone I talked to, every private Facebook group I got into, every book, they just said these people are difficult, leave them, divorce them, cut them off from your family. Those were the answers, even from the therapist. Most therapists won't see people with borderline personality disorder, so I knew there was something to be listened to. So that's an amazing thing. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I was able to, at one point, be exposed to a concept that really sent me down a different path, that really gave me hope. And it was a basic concept that the way our brains work, they're wired off of perceptions of experiences. So as we go through life, our brain creates all these maps of the world. Experiences based off of the perception at that moment. It creates a memory and a program that runs in our brain. And our brain is made up of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of programs that we've created throughout our lives. And there's a way to go look at those and see what they do to us. See what they make us think and how we perceive. Because perception is a major root cause of all mental illnesses. I mean, there are other parts and pieces, but perception is always a part of it. It's always a major part of it. Because if you think of disorders like PTSD, right? You have two people in a foxhole and a bomb goes in that foxhole and blows up, and one person comes out with PTSD and they can't even function in life anymore, and the other one, who maybe lost their leg, goes on to live this incredible life and it has almost no effect. So the problem with the mainstream and the way that science has looked at it is they take apart and they look at the person where they're at now that they have it. And they say, okay, so their biochemistry is off, and the way their brain is functioning is off, and all these things, and so they create medications and they create all these things to try to change those symptoms. So the focus has been mostly on symptoms of what people are experiencing and trying to target what those symptoms are. Well, it's not working very well. And if it is, there's other problems, because things like depression, for example, the medications, antidepressants, are prescribed 400 times more today than they were 20 years ago. Only 20 years ago. So we're talking 1999. That long ago, 400 times as much. So it's not really solving the problem. It might be for some people in some cases, and there are ways, there is a place for it, so I'm not saying that that's the only factor, but mainstream has had a hard time because they've focused so much on the symptoms of what's going on. And there's a gentleman, his name is Dr. Martin Seligman, and he has started this new wave in psychology. And that wave is to help get the focus off of the symptoms and go to the core of the problem. Try to understand the person, understand what the reasoning was. In other words, the perceptions, all those perceptions put together created a reasoning. And the reasoning that they used in that moment is what created the outcome. It created the response. So now we're learning, and actually psychology and neurology have been two really separate fields. So much so that they speak different languages. So for years and years and years, they've both been in different areas, and it's only a few pioneers that are coming out now at Yale University and Harvard. As I started to learn more, I started to really study what new technology was giving us, and surprisingly, in just the last few years, it's exploded with information. There's thousands of research papers available and things that kind of back up more of this different way of thinking about the brain. And the real problem is that to get all that out to all of the practitioners and all of the doctors and everybody who's doing it, it takes a long time. It takes a long time for that all work into the system. And I was so excited as I studied to find schools that were actually there, that they were learning it and studying it to an extent. So I want to talk. There's two major discoveries that they discovered in the last 10 to 15 years. They discovered, neurologically they discovered it, but what it meant took them a long time to figure out. And the two things are, I'll write them up here. So one is neuroplasticity, and the other one is neurogenesis. So for years, they thought that the brain was a static thing. Once it was developed to full development, then it was static, which means that once you have a habit or a behavior or an addiction in the brain, then that's going to be there for the rest of your life. That's why they didn't go back and try to that's why they didn't go back to the core reasoning, because they thought it was in the neurology, which was stuck. They believed that it was a static thing. So real quickly, I have some, I don't know if everybody can see that down below. But, so this is what a brain cell looks like, a neuron. So, and it's not just in the brain, it goes throughout the body. It's a communication system. But in the brain, of course, is where they're really packed in. So what they believed before is wherever these arms attached to these other arms, I won't go into this language, and they create this synapse, once that was there, then technology didn't allow them to go further and actually see that it can change. So they thought once you have these maps played out, in other words, when a neuron fires, it goes a certain direction, goes a certain area and place, and that's how we think, then it's always going to fire that way. It's always going to be there. And that one they discovered about 20 years ago that wasn't true. They realized they had enough technology to see that, oh, that's not actually true. They can change. They can actually let go, and they can reattach. And it's actually happening quite a bit in our brains. And so neuroplasticity is the ability to totally change the way that you perceive and think, so you have a different response to something. So we can take someone who, well, let me actually talk a little bit more about what happens in that process. An addiction is anything that we do neurologically, is anything that we do repetitively over and over and over, but doesn't have the outcome that we really truly want. So in the brain, a mental illness and an addiction look the same. They are the same kind of thing. The brain is addicted, and there's a reward system that's rewarding it on a subconscious level. It's telling it, this is how you should think. This is how you do it. This is where you go to be rewarded for that way of thinking. It sounds bizarre, but even someone who is having PTSD or depression or anger issues or any of those, there's a part of their brain that is rewarding them for going there. And it turns into a belief system. And these neurons, the more you fire a signal down those neurons, the more of these arms will connect again and again and create a stronger connection between them. So it's like creating a freeway in an area that you think in and that you repeat in. And so that's what becomes the patterns that we get stuck in, because electricity runs down the path of least resistance. And the more connections you have between them, the easier it is for the electricity to run down that path. So we just keep thinking the same way over and over and over, and we fall into that path. The other thing is that when your brain's doing that, and you tend to keep going to that same area, so I'm going to use depression because it's so common. You go to that area every time you have an experience, you perceive in a certain way, and it takes you to that part of the brain, and it goes over and over and over. Well, the other parts of the brain that aren't being used start to let go of these, so that they don't. So when an electrical current goes down this and it jumps across this synapse, it has to have a certain amount of strength. And the more that you do it, the stronger that gets, and the more attachment it feels. But as you stop firing down it, it starts to let go, and it starts to not let the electrical current run through it. So, and our brain is a really efficient part. It actually burns a lot more of our energy than we think. Our brain is it's a power, it uses a lot of power because all this electricity is running through it all the time. And so, as we're not using that part of the brain, the other part of the brain starts to atrophy. Or not really atrophy, but to let go and to start to reform so it's not being used. So that's one, neuroplasticity is one major piece of information. They discovered it about 20 years ago, but it wasn't until about 10 to 8 years ago that they started to realize what it meant. Like they could see it with their technology, but they're like, so what is that? What does it mean? What does it lead to? So what? Now what? And then the studies started to show that people can really change their habits. They can change their perceptions. They can change the way that they respond to something based off of how they see things. And it happens to us throughout life. Because when we start out in life, we're just a little baby, and we have one way of meeting our needs. Anybody know what it is? Yeah. We scream. And we'll scream right in someone's face to get what we want, and we don't care. And it's all about just meeting our needs through that one way, that one behavior. And so in that process, we create patterns that rely on external things to meet our needs. So that's one part of it. The other part of it answers a lot of questions about why we're where we're at as a society or as a world. So why has mental illness skyrocketed? Why are we in a place where one out of every 5 people in the United States goes in and gets help for a mental illness? 1 out of every 5. But there are studies that say up to 80% of people who need help don't go in. So that means that technically, if we saw those numbers, that easily half of people have a significant mental illness that they could get help for, if the help was available. So neurogenesis is the creation of new cells. That they didn't discover until about 10 years ago. And even then, they're like, what does that mean? If you recall, most everybody in this room is old enough to remember that this is your brain, and this is your brain on drugs. And then everybody said, don't do drugs because you only have so many brain cells, and when they're gone, they're gone. And you're not going to get them back. And so we had this belief that you could, that there was also this other limiting thing of not being able to recreate and reproduce brain cells. Well, they discovered that that's totally false. We create thousands of brain cells every day. We start the creation of thousands. If we're in good health, more than thousands. I mean, multiple thousands. If we're not in very good health, under 1,000, hundreds. And I would encourage everybody to look into this, because our lifestyle, the way that we live and what we're experiencing, is creating the decrease of neurogenesis. That means that we have less cells being produced. And it's mostly done in the very center of the brain, in the hippocampus. And the thing they didn't understand, and they started measuring and noticing and researching, and they're like, wow, we produce a lot of cells there. As a matter of fact, we replace cells really fast. And by the time we're about 50 years old or so, 50 to 55, we've replaced the entire thing with new cells. So yeah, we're doing actually a lot. What they didn't realize until just the last few years is what that means to the rest of the brain. And what they found is that, and I didn't read my other, what they found is that the other thing that's skyrocketing is Alzheimer's. Most of you probably didn't know they spend billions of dollars every year trying to find a drug to stop or slow down or do anything to Alzheimer's, and they haven't come out with anything new since 2003. And they spend over $5 billion a year. And the reason is because if they can figure it out, they will be rich. Because the projection is that in 10 years, people who are passing away of old age in 10 years from now, 50% of them will have Alzheimer's. So the effect of this neurogenesis is happening. What Alzheimer's is that the hippocampus actually has holes. It's empty. It's got spaces that don't have neurons, that don't have any brain cells. And so, and there's two really critical things to understand about the hippocampus. One is that it creates new memories. So if our neurogenesis is low, if our production of new cells is low, then our ability to create new memories is low. But more importantly, at least in this context, is that it's a regulator to our emotions. So it helps us regulate emotions. It's not the creator. There's other places of the brain that mostly create them. It's the one that helps regulate what our emotions are. So those are the two really big breakthroughs that are really new, that are just working their way finally, slowly into the mainstream. And schools are the ones who are mostly coming up with it. So at the Neuro Clinic, so that we all know kind of the context here. So the Neuro Clinic, Dr. Oliver, I met him after my wife and I came in, and she got help with what he was doing. And the mixture of what he was doing and what I was doing has put her into an incredible place where she is totally living a different life, completely. I know more than anyone else, I'll put it on it. Because with borderline, it's all about relationships. And so, it's started from social anxiety disorder. And so the social anxiety disorder is where you're always putting on your best self in front of people the best you can. And so it was mostly hidden from most people. But she has made major changes. The focus of the Neuro Clinic, when I met him and I was studying neuroplasticity, is that they go and they look at all of your neurons throughout your whole system, your brain and everywhere else, and they measure the signal going through it. And they don't diagnose anybody with anything. They just look to see if the neurons are firing well. And what they find is that there's patterns, that people who have certain things have certain patterns in the clarity of their neurons, how well they can send it through. So basically what he's doing is he's finding the areas of the brain that have started to let go because they're not being used, making it really hard for someone to switch over and start thinking a different way and solving their problems and overcoming their problems. And so he has different tests that he does and measurements, and he shows what's going on. And then he teaches exercises that you can take home with you. And they're just these things you do with your body while you're moving your eyes, and it just happens to be that's where that pathway is. And if you keep firing it by doing the exercises, those pathways will start to strengthen, and these will start to have more attachments. And I'll tell you, the way they started out is they worked with people with brain injuries and brain trauma, because in brain trauma we damage part of the brain and it stops functioning. And so these neurons, they just start firing everywhere. Whenever a signal comes into this, it just fires out to all of them. And it looks for places to go, depending on where it's connected. So what he had learned and studied is that when they were finding these people who had a brain injury, they were not connected and not firing. And so they go to therapy or physical therapy, and their brain finds another way to do it. But it's not the real way that it was intended. It's not the real way that really is the best for someone. So you might see someone who had some kind of brain trauma, and they can't move their arms very well, and they shake a lot, but they can still kind of do things. Well, what he was doing is he's like, well, the other part of the brain is working now. We just got to get it connecting and get things so that it'll function better. So then they do these therapies to help that other part of the brain start to connect and function again. And now all of a sudden, these people who tried everything and they were taking medications and they were going through therapies and doing all these things, and they come into him, and in not very much time, they're like completely functional again, like walking, or I mean, really life-changing things. And in the process, people were coming back and saying, now, just so you know, it worked really well, but also, I had this mental illness I was struggling with that I'm not struggling with anymore. It's not that tough anymore. And so then, they started to research more in that direction. And so now, he's focusing a lot on helping people with mental struggles and finding a lot of success. And he brought me on because when I came in and explained what I did, and I'll explain a little bit more about what I did, he goes, that is what we need. That's the other piece that we really got to put into this puzzle, because that is big. And so what I do, it stems from the concepts around neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, but it is much more, because the complexity of the mental illness that my wife was struggling with caused me to, and the fact that we were related, which adds another dynamic to it. If you talk to any therapist, they'll say, I never work with family. Because there's this added dynamic that really makes it more complex. It caused me to dig deeper and dig deeper and dig deeper and find way more around the subject and the concepts that NLP has to offer. And so what I do is I help people to understand how their brain is working, understand how their maps are laid out in their brain, and the value of knowing, because one of the things we discovered is that perceptions change where we process things in our brain. It's actually a different place in the brain that we go. And depending on where we go, will give us different options or different resources. So if we go in our brain to a place that doesn't have the resources, we're not going to solve the problem very well. And we're going to get stuck there, and we're going to start spinning. And so teaching people how their brain is working and how it all fits together, why they go to that place, and to help them rewire and rethink and see from a different perception what that is, so that and people talk about, going back to their experience that created the problem and everything like that. You don't really have to do that. Sometimes I do, because they want that, or there's other reasons, but it's not really that necessary, because it's about what's playing right now. What is the program that's playing and putting them where they are to give them those perceptions. And then I teach them a bunch of different things about the brain and neurology, how things work, so that they know things they can do, and give them resources that help them see how to do something in the moment, how to change what they're thinking in the moment, what they're focused on, what it means to them, so that they can take charge of their perception, therefore sending that signal to another area of the brain that is much more capable of solving the problem. Because it's really just about getting it to that part of the brain. Once you get it to that part of the brain, then woo, it's a party. It's a party, and and things just flow, and there's so much information over there. Has anybody seen the movie Limitless?
Yeah.
that concept comes from these discoveries, that we can access much more of what's available in our brains, like just by being in the right place and having the right perceptions. And so helping people to understand that concept and watching them change, really sometimes incredibly miraculously. I can go on. I have so many examples and stories of people that were in severe mental struggles, and they were able to change in a way where the way of acting before just didn't make sense. Because if you think about it, why does one person do something and then another person, there's no way they would do it? It's their belief system. It's their patterns that they've got. And to clarify, most of the patterns in our brains are not from our choosing. Or I should say, they're not our fault. Because most of our life that we're doing the most creation of our brain and our patterns, up until the age 7, our consciousness is not even, we don't have an awareness of our consciousness till after we're about 7. In other words, our maps are being created and we're just, our subconscious is constantly just catching everything and creating maps and doing all this stuff. And we don't really have much to do with it at all. It's just the perceptions of our brain. And then after we get past 7, we begin to have a little glimpses of our cognition or our awareness. And so when we judge other people, we're trying to judge them off of our maps, because that's mostly all we have. We only have little glimpses of other people's maps. And so we're using our own to try to judge everyone else and what they should do. So one of the things that I really help make clear to people is that I don't judge what they're doing at all. That's not what I'm going for. I'm just looking for their maps. And I don't blame them for getting their maps, because the decisions they made in life were all based off of the maps that were created, most of which they didn't choose. And I believe that there's a reason for every choice that they make that has a purpose, that needs to give them something, that needs to help them adjust and change what their maps are. Does anybody have any questions so far?
I just wanted to see if you have an example that, we could kind of follow from the map that they had to
a map
what
that
they changed to.
So, yeah. So for example, who in here has ever felt depressed? Who wants to share? Doesn't have to be severe depression, just any level of any kind of depression. Does anybody have a moment they can remember where they just felt down for some reason?
Do you have to pick one?
Too many choices.
Yeah, I think we all just have those moments where you've had a bad day at work, or you've had a bad interaction with people around you,
Mhm.
and things have been said, and I tend to withdraw. That's my, and I go to my cave, and
That's your mechanism.
that's my quiet moment.
Yeah, that's your escape.
Right.
So for a second, I'll talk about escape, because escape is our biggest problem with this process, this neurogenesis process, and the neuroplasticity process. Because right now, what society provides to us right now, and what our lifestyle provides, is lots of ways to escape. And our brain is learning, hey, I don't have to deal with any of this crap. I'll just wait until I can escape. Because there's all kinds of escapes. There's video games for kids. And there's a really good 2020 that I should share with you about brain scans of people who are addicted to video games and what it does to their brain. And then after they take away the video games and they haven't had them for 3 months, how much their brain completely changes. Like absolutely, totally different animal. It's a different thing. But we have video games, we have entertainment of all sorts, tons and tons of different kinds of entertainment, including pornography. We have all kinds of other ways that we think are fulfilling our needs. So there's a researcher at Yale that right now, it's awesome to see that she is just, her popularity is just skyrocketing. She has the biggest enrollment of any class ever at Yale. They actually had to rent out a local chapel to house how many people were coming into her class on the second semester that she did it, which was only last year. This year she came on and did an online course, because she was the most talked about teacher in the US in her class, because it was focusing on how to get away from what the world, what our environment was basically giving to us, which is lots and lots of ways to escape our issues. So, for example, I did a presentation at BYU. A kid was sitting on the second row, and I talked about video games, and he's like, oh, whoa, hey, hold on there. He's like, video games, they help me a ton because I come from work and I'm worn out and I'm beat up and I sit down and I just let it all go and I just enjoy and I just, love that experience. It makes me feel so much better. And I said, oh, so it works for you. Yeah, it works. Okay, so now you love work. And work is fun now to go to. You don't come home worn out and beat. And he was like, oh, yeah, I didn't solve your problem. You just escaped your problem. It felt good. Which I'm afraid is what a lot of other methodologies are to deal with mental illnesses. Is there are other ways to escape, which only decreases the neurogenesis and the neuroplasticity. So taking medications, oftentimes, hopefully the medication is to help you break patterns and to get into new patterns so you can get off the medication. But if you're just on this medication for years and years and years, then what you're doing is just escaping your situation. You're just escaping your problems. You're not solving your problems. You're just escaping the process of going to that area of the brain to solve your problem. And then you're just staying in this other area, which is full of fear and threat and fight or flight. And then you're just escaping to that all the time, and you learn that it's all... And then we came out with these cell phones that have all the entertainment in the world right there in every way we want at any moment. How long do I have to wait? Do I have to get a ticket? Do I have to drive anywhere? Do I have to wait for it to come on television? No, I just go right there anytime and boom, I can be doing 100 different things that entertain me, or 1,000, or 1 billion, something like that. Did you have something?
I just wanted to make a comment to him about what I've learned from you about the maps and how it's changed my life. Is that what you're wanting? So one of the biggest ahas I had, and Lamont hasn't talked about this yet, is he taught me that all of us have our own filter with different words and what it means to us because of our map or our experience. My husband's a football coach, and one day we were driving down the road and I was talking to him. I was brought on downstairs when the original 2 doctors split the practice. So I said, the practice split, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, wait a minute, I don't understand what you're telling me. And it took a few minutes of us talking because when I said practice, he was thinking football practice and I was thinking doctor's office. So that's a simple one right there. But with me, I had incredible health challenges from the time I was 25 years old. I had my first grand mal seizure and all these things happened, and our families just kind of disappeared. And as our daughters got sick, it just got worse and worse. And I had all this anger for years because I had a dad that the biggest thing he taught me was to take care of other people and serve them. And I'm like, what is wrong with my own mother, my mother-in-law, my kids' aunts and uncles? They have disappeared. And I know that's not what they're taught in church and blah, 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 blah. And I had a recollection with my mother. Her mother died when she was 12, and I didn't understand that she couldn't be in hospitals, that sick people were the most difficult thing for her to deal with. I didn't understand that for a long time. I just thought, this is my mother and she's not coming to help me or call me and see if I'm okay. And I had many teachers. One of the things that happened with me is I flipped numbers my whole life. That got fixed through this. I didn't come for that, but it was something that happened. To be 50 years old and flip numbers your whole life, you have to compensate in a lot of ways. Dialing a phone number, doing the car code, balancing a checkbook is extremely difficult. And now I'm 55, but this was 3 years ago, and I don't have that challenge anymore. That's just one of them, and being off all my medications. And so I've been able to step back and understand that they had no clue about what I was going through. And to them, I was being lazy, I was being a drama queen, I was being this and that, because they didn't deal with it. They just wanted me to pull up my bootstraps and get to work, and I didn't have the tools or the ability to do it. And I can tell you, I'm sorry to cry, that something I've tried to do for 30 years, to have a good relationship with my own extended family, and try over and over and over again and offend them because I was talking from my map, my experiences, so it put them on the defense. And this happened with my daughter too. Lamont's taught me, and you would think, well, she's just upset because of her health issues. I wasn't taking it that way. I thought, oh, I know her better than anybody. I've been the one that's cared for her. I've been the one that's been here by myself. And you're able to heal, and you have this resiliency to go and have forgiveness in your life and mend relationships that, you know, are different because your whole understanding changes about why we interact with each other. And so I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but
Yeah.
that's been a really powerful experience for me. And I'm in the middle of mending relationships that with my own siblings and my mother-in-law and things that I didn't think would ever happen. And so I'm so grateful. I'm so sorry to cry and
No,
stuff.
that's fine. That's what it's all about, so.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing, is those
Yeah.
relationships.
You talk about unhealthy escaping. The healthy, is there a healthy escape?
Yeah, there is.
Look at that one.
It would look like not all day, every day. It would be one that had awareness to it, so that you knew why you're doing it and what you're doing, and you would have a purpose. Really, what I'm doing is I'm helping people just see that they're here and they want to be here, and the way to get there. That because our brains just don't see it, because it's tainted with all these maps that are in our way to get from here to there. And so really what I'm doing, and the reason when you ask for an example, I can give an example, but the problem with examples is that it's based off of maps. So when I work with someone, I have to see their map. And then I have to use that map to help them unravel it and understand it differently. And that's why to give an example, there would be maybe one other person in the room that might sort of understand the example from one person. Because it takes their maps to change it. And so what I do is I meet with them in what's called a clarity session. And it's just like we're just talking. To them it just seems like they're talking. But what I'm doing is I'm analyzing their sentence structure, their body language, their tones, a whole bunch of things that they don't know they're giving me. Because when you speak to someone, you are telling them, what you tell them is from your conscious mind, but the way that you tell them is a representation of your maps and your subconscious and how it thinks. And so I just go through a kind of a conversational thing, and I just discover where their maps are, what their ways of thinking is, how they prioritize, and what sends them to different areas of the brain. And then I use their maps to help them see it. Their way of thinking, their way of talking and speaking, and their values, to help them go through and recognize at a new level what it all really means and what it takes to get here, and how to just move all these things out of the way, disconnect, move to a different area of the brain, and then just get to the place that they want. And once they see it clearly, and there's some details in there, I guess, but it did take me quite a while to get to that point. But it's really just giving a new perception where they see it differently. I mean, if you were to tell me about a situation where you felt depressed, and then I asked you, well, what if you had this perception? What would it have done to you? What if you had this perception? What if you had this? What if you thought? Because in your mind, our brains are always trying to predict. That's like, we have a predictive brain. That's why it does everything, is it wants to predict so it can get what it wants. And it's horrible at it. It is no good at predicting, but that's what it does. That's all it does. But we have so many maps in our way of our prediction process, and it's so tainted with what our world experiences that it just gets in our way. So as we